right, hello and welcome to the final session of our Iowa Ideas In-Depth Week on mental health. Iowa Ideas is a year-round series of content and gatherings, including this week's In-Depth Week. Thanks to presenting sponsor ITC Midwest for their sponsorship on all things related to Iowa Ideas in 2024. And thanks to this In-Depth Week's presenting sponsor, Foundation 2, which is our neighbor right across the street. My neighbor is Marissa Payne. I'm a local government reporter for the Gazette, and I will be your moderator. This session is on working to reduce stigma and avoidance of care, basically exploring the barriers that may keep people from seeking and receiving the mental health care that they need and how we can perhaps chart a better path forward. With that, I will let our panelists introduce themselves and then we'll dive in. I'll start with Jami, who's first up on my screen.
Hi, Jami Haberl. I serve as the Executive Director for the Iowa Healthiest State Initiative. We're a statewide nonprofit organization working to improve the health of Iowans. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Lisa?
Hi, I'm Lisa Turner. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I'm the Clinical Director for Catholic Charities Counseling. Catholic Charities is a social service agency, and we represent the 30 most northeast counties in Iowa. Within that area, we have 5 counseling offices and 12 licensed therapists.
Thank you. And Barry.
Hi, everybody. I'm Barry Schreier. I'm a licensed psychologist. I made my career for 30 years in campus mental health, working in counseling centers, and more recently, I'm on faculty in our doctoral program in counseling psychology at the University of Iowa. And I'm also the director of what's called the higher education program in the Scanlon Center for School Mental Health, where we are focused on staff and faculty, mental health, and well-being.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us. So to dive into things, we talked a little before, just with planning this panel, about the historical conversation on stigma and perhaps how we've seen some progress on that. Why do you think that is that we've been able to make progress on conversations about mental health, and where do you feel we are at now about those conversations and, you know, making mental health treatment kind of as commonplace as physical health?
I'd be glad to get started. Yeah, so I think I've been in campus mental health for over 30 years, and I certainly have seen giant progress across those years. To the point that I would say we're now suffering many of the problems of our success. 30 years ago, most students did not seek out mental health services. And now we are in a situation on college campuses, at least, where services simply can't keep up with the demand. So we've done a really nice job in mitigating a lot of the stigma that used to exist by telling folks, go get help. And if you are struggling, talk to someone about it. And we've done so much of that work across the last few decades that we are finding, once again, we now cannot keep up with the demand. The other thing I will say is it's not one size fits all. And we see stigma persist in some cultural communities where we've done a great job really kind of ameliorating it in other cultural communities. But I've seen a lot of progress. Even if we are still managing stigma, it certainly is much different than it was even just a couple of decades ago.
Yeah, I agree. Oh, I'm sorry, Marissa.
Sorry, no, I was just going to follow up with Barry on that, because I only have perspective on like Iowa's college campuses since 2016. I'm an Iowa grad, but you know that the students worked there with administration and the regents to get that mental health fee passed and add more counselors. Would you say that that is something that has had an impact on the stigma on college campuses, or has the movement, in your view, kind of been even longer?
I think it's been much longer than that. I think we've seen institutional response, right? Because now there are consumers seeking services at levels in unprecedented numbers. And so then we see institutional response to that. But it's been in the making for really sort of two and a half decades.
Lisa?
Well, I was just going to agree with Barry and say that as younger generations have more education about social and emotional learning in school, and they grow and become of age, and young adults, there is just more of a normalization around the conversation of mental health, which then creates this, great problem we have, which is that people are open to services, but we don't always have the providers to meet that need.
And I think so I'm not a mental health, therapist or trained even in mental health. And when I think about, where we were in 2019 and where we are today, just based on the work that we've been doing with our Make It Okay campaign, which is really getting people just to even understand, that mental health is part of your health and how do we just have caring conversations. And sometimes it's not even that people need to seek necessarily any type of services. Maybe they just need to know that they have a place to express or share some of the challenges of everyday life, right? And so when I think of where we were in 2019, when we launched that campaign, there was still, we had, stigma's been working to be reduced, but the pandemic really highlighted that we all have mental health. And I think that really has changed the trajectory of the conversation, right? Because we all went through a global pandemic. It directly impacted people's overall mental well-being as a whole. And I think people started to recognize that we need to be able to seek services just like you need to when it comes to physical well-being. I think we still have pockets. I think there's generational stigma that exists, and there's other components of our population that stigma looks different within. And so how do we continue to foster the opportunity for people to have those open conversations, have caring conversations? So when you do have a loved one, a neighbor, a coworker, who may need support, that you can actually have that conversation. I mean, when I was growing up, we didn't learn about mental health. We didn't learn about our brain really in terms of that you could have a mental illness, like I could have a physical illness. So it's understandable that generations don't even know how to have that conversation, and the stigma that existed when they were growing up. When I think of my 91-year-old grandmother, it's very different than a conversation with my father, who is a rural Iowa farmer. And it's different than talking to my nieces and nephews who, mental health is like a normal conversation within that generation. And so I think stigma, yes, has it gone down, but I think we still have opportunities to help support communities to make sure that they have the language that they need to just even have a conversation and understand what they can do to support their loved ones or individuals within those specific kind of communities throughout the state of Iowa.
And since we've made reference to COVID and the impact that that had on mental health, what demand have we seen kind of since the pandemic for mental health services in Iowa? And what has been the lasting impact of the pandemic on mental health care in the state?
One of the significant changes, and I wouldn't call it evolutionary, I would say it's been revolutionary, is the ability to access mental health care virtually. And prior to the pandemic, virtual care was certainly around, but it was pretty much on the sidelines. It wasn't something that most practitioners did. And then in the advent of the pandemic, one had to go virtual, or one could not provide service and one could not earn an income. And so truly in a revolutionary way, we saw mental health practitioners in unprecedented numbers learning how to engage in virtual counseling. And now it's to the point that if you live in a rural community and there aren't mental health practitioners geographically in your area, well, it doesn't seem to make much difference anymore, because you can virtually connect with a therapist anywhere in your state. And then depending on the nature of the therapist, you may be actually able to talk to therapists in any state. It doesn't even have to be in Iowa any longer for a number of professionals in a majority of states. And so we have seen a revolution in terms of accessibility to mental health services that really never existed before.
Yeah, I would say since 2020, the total number of counseling appointments that we have at Catholic Charities has increased by 25%. And in the last year alone, our telehealth appointments have increased by 30%. Children account for 20% more of our appointments than they did 5 years ago. And so we do see that there's an increase in need, but also a matched increase in accessibility, and not just with rural areas. If you're living in an urban community, but you can't seem to get an appointment in your own town, you might be able to connect with a counselor in a different town who has availability by telehealth. So I do think it's really kind of opened up opportunities. And I think Jami touched on this a little bit, but some of this increase might also be not just an acceptance of counseling, but sometimes people pathologize normal stressors. and so are seeking professional help when really there's other types of more informal supports that might suffice. But counseling can also be a way to educate people about the best resources for their needs. So hopefully it's opening a conversation and communication either way.
And I think what's really exciting, like, is the fact that the telehealth has really expanded and it's provided those opportunities, especially in our rural parts, but it's also provided opportunities for individuals of different cultures to find a therapist potentially. Maybe they can't find an in-person therapist who, if I'm a Black individual and I'm trying to find someone of, who is also Black as a therapist, maybe you can't find that person in person, but by having telehealth, you have the opportunity to maybe find people who can relate to your cultures differently than where before COVID, that was even more challenging for many different cultures in our state to actually find people that, understand maybe the historical trauma of their culture or understand, just the different cultures that exist. You may not have even had an opportunity to find someone that could actually understand and help treat you in a way that's appropriate for your own personal interests, I guess, right?
Yeah, and from the work that you all have done, what are some of the barriers that Iowans are facing in terms of just recognizing that they could benefit from seeing someone and seeking mental health care, and how can people kind of recognize when they're, at a point of needing support for their mental health issues?
I realize I've gone first each time, so I'm deflecting going first this time.
I thought we had
Lisa's turn.
developed this great rhythm, but
I'm breaking it up. I'm tearing down the silo. Yep, there we go.
So I think that the education piece is really important on this, that teaching people to recognize signs and symptoms and not to diagnose their friends and family, because that's always, dangerous. But to recognize the signs and symptoms in themselves, or even just to learn that language so that they can have those conversations and ask if somebody is having a problem. I think that sometimes our first step is to visit with a physician and just to ask questions and educate. But I do think that education piece is really, really important. And I could become a giant commercial for mental health first aid. And so we're going to have to rein that in for maybe a different question and answer here. But I think that just teaching people how to recognize what's going on in themselves and giving them language is the first step.
Yeah, I would agree with what Lisa said. So, it's threefold. One is, would I even recognize distress in a friend if I saw it? And if I did recognize distress, would I know what to do? And if I did know what to do, then sort of what's the limit of my role with a friend? And if I wanted to make connection with resources other than myself, would I know how to do that? And so that begins to raise then the issue of one of the problems of our success is we have told folks for so long, if you have any concerns whatsoever, go talk to someone about it, which in the face of it sounds really good, right? If you are having concerns, go seek help. What it has created is what we have discovered is that normative worries have now become mental health concerns. To the point that we know on college campuses that our students by and by really can't tell the difference any longer between stress and anxiety. Everything's anxiety. And what we know is that many of our students, most of them in most situations, are simply managing what we would call normative worries. And it can be everything from, I didn't pass an exam to, I had a death in my family, which certainly feels terrible, obviously, is a massive loss in both situations, but are normative in their stance. And so one of the things that we really try to communicate, and I think it's a really nice message, is if you have concerns, talk to someone, anyone. And you don't necessarily have to go seek the mental health professional or even your medical health professional. You might turn to a trusted friend, or maybe there is that family member. Or if it's important identity-wise, you might turn to a clergy member. But the fact of the matter is talk to someone. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a mental health professional, because a lot of the struggles that we have are normative worries and are not necessarily mental health concerns that need that level of care. And again, it's great that we have communicated so well. If you have concerns, go get help. But in some ways, we are now suffering the problems of our success is that we have turn normative worries into mental health concerns, and now have begun to sort of block up a system that's there to sort of serve a certain level of concern, where now it's serving all levels of concerns.
I don't know that I have anything else to add. I think they both covered it beautifully.
Alrighty. I mean, in Iowa, Barry has mentioned kind of dealing with the consequences of our success. What has worked to reduce stigma in Iowa and kind of provide people with the tools to talk about mental health care with others? I think, Jami, this will probably be a good starting point for you, because you can dive into Make It Okay and kind of how that started in Iowa.
Yeah, so I mean, there's been a lot of work on this space, right? And so, I mean, just one of the ways that we've been, have, I guess, kind of came to the conversation around the mental health work is with the launch of the Make It Okay campaign, which really is about starting caring conversations. So how do we give people the tools to even know how to respond if someone should share with them, like, they have had a diagnosis even, right? So this has happened to me in my own life, where someone has shared that they were diagnosed with bipolar disorder. So giving me the tools even to understand, how do I respond to that in a respectful way, and not just, I think, devoid the question, right? Because it's easy for us to be just like, oh, the weather's beautiful out today. Like, I don't want to talk about this. I don't know what to say, so I'm not going to say anything at all. And so Make It Okay really is meant to be kind of that entry point to help people have some tools and maybe things to say and maybe things not to say that aren't so helpful. And again, it's that generational part of it. We didn't learn about mental health growing up. And so how do we have some of those skills so that we can be caring, empathetic, and supportive members of our community to help those who may be living with a mental illness or may just be having a challenging day, like Barry talked about, right? Like, you may have a death in the family. You may just have some of those normal stressors. So how can you actually have caring conversations and be supportive of those individuals to really start helping reduce the stigma? I think going beyond that, and Lisa talked about this, I think a great training opportunity is the mental health first aid training. So a lot of us have learned first aid, we've learned CPR. Well, now it's time for us to be learning mental health first aid as well. And so how do we continue to build that education and understanding within each and every one of us, so that helps just reduce your overall stigma as a whole. And since launching in 2019, my own personal stigmas and biases have definitely continued to improve, because I am interacting, having more conversations around this. I have a better understanding. A lot of that comes back to education. And so by taking the opportunity to continue to learn, there are lots of great training opportunities available around just what is mental health, what's mental illness, signs and symptoms. And I think we can all continue to take advantage of those so that we can better reduce the stigma that exists within our state when it does come to talking about mental health and mental illnesses.
Yeah, I think the reality is that we're never going to have enough providers for the number of people who are seeking services. And one-on-one therapy, while awesome, I mean, like, it's what I do, I think it's the best thing ever, but it's never going to be the answer to all of our problems. And so expanding our reach by through education or through group processes is another way to meet that need. We've reduced stigma a lot. There's still more work to be done, but in the meantime, as we educate people, as we teach them person-first, non-stigmatizing language, we can help them to connect to other soft supports in the community, which then just expands all of our resources and supports. And then, like Barry said, it allows more space in the counseling room for those clients who truly have that high level of acute need, even chronic need, of serious mental illness and those types of diagnoses.
Yeah, I would add on just to say all these programs are good ones. The Healthiest State Initiative program and mental health first aid, and there's several of these kinds of products out there because there's such need. We recently here at the University of Iowa conducted a survey. We had 16 campuses in the state of Iowa that included private colleges, community colleges. Over 2,500 staff and faculty responded to the survey. And one of the area of questions that we asked staff and faculty was, do you find yourself called in to respond to student mental health? And the answer was unequivocally, yes, I am called in to do that as a regular part of my job. We also asked staff and faculty, do you feel competent and confident to do that? And the response to that was overwhelmingly, no, I don't feel either of those things, even though I am already called into service to do that. And then we asked staff and faculty, and this is particularly, I can say this about faculty since I am, if it was required, would you do it? And faculty endorsed it. And the word faculty and required in the same sentence is an unusual thing. And it just sort of goes to show that we are already responding as a community to each other. It's unavoidable now that we are now hearing from people around us of their concerns and their worries, and that there is a desire to feel competent and confident in that, and that if training was available to me kind of at the level of mental health first aid or any other kind of product that is out there, people will do it. And so I think we're really at a nice time in our development for this sort of like first aid level type of response, not the professional level, but me as a person in the community, skilling up so that I feel competent and confident in those moments when someone says, I just got a diagnosis. I was like, oh, I know sort of how to talk about this and lean in and connect with a colleague or a friend or a supervisee or whoever it might be, to then lend aid and support, and then maybe connection to actual professional services if that's what's indicated.
But it sounds like from you all, there's kind of a growing number of workplaces that are kind of taking on this task of training and equipping employees to respond to the mental health needs of those around them. I mean, for other organizations out there that maybe haven't adopted these trainings yet, what would be kind of a good first step for them to do so, so that way their employees kind of are looking out for each other and have the language to respond to other people's mental health needs?
I think that's a great Jami question. It's a really good
I mean,
program for Iowa employers out there.
Yeah, so I think an easy starting place is the Make It Okay campaign. So we have an opportunity where workplaces of any size, of any type, can become a registered workplace. They have access to a toolkit, and then we do presentations. That's a 1-hour presentation to get people started. I mean, I would love for all 3 million Iowans to do mental health first aid training. I don't know that it will happen, maybe not in my lifetime. So like, how do we at least get the conversation started? And I think what's been exciting to watch what the workplaces we have worked with here in Iowa that have done the Make It Okay presentation, then it starts to open up more doors, because the questions that they receive from their employees are, well, we want to learn more. What other trainings can we get? What other speakers can come in, right? And so I think that's what's been beautiful, is we provide a starting point, but we aren't the ending point. There's so many amazing opportunities and trainings that are available, and speakers that, we refer people to say, well, this would be a great next step. And so I think if workplaces aren't having conversations around mental health, I would highly recommend that you start, because I think we all need to be having this conversation. And an easy way to start is by checking out the Make It Okay website for Iowa and becoming a registered site and downloading the toolkit, and then asking for a presentation or joining one of our public presentations that we do every single month. That can be a way to get the ball started, so that hopefully they would continue by doing, mental health first aid training or other types of presentations and conversations around this very important topic.
There's also really great data out there, and I'm sure, Jami, you know about this, but there's really great data that says if you as an employer are indicating in your recruitment processes that you're attentive not only to sort of you as a worker, but you as a human, your recruitment success is better. And then in terms of retention of an employee, once you have recruited them, again, this attentiveness to sort of the personal and professional interaction that we now have, especially if I'm working at home and I'm not entirely separate of my personal life when I'm engaging in my professional life, also helps a lot with retention.
I did want to plug for those of you viewing this at home, at work, wherever you are, to please pass along questions or comments in the chat box, and I'll be happy to incorporate those in the panel while we still have time left with each other. We've touched a little on some of the provider, lack of providers, and some of those challenges with providing care. But what are some other reasons that Iowans may be avoiding mental health care, and I know before this panel, some of you touched on, kind of the role of the economy and just the tough choices people are having to make, for their own pocketbooks. But yeah.
Yeah, the cost of services continues to be a barrier to care. The high cost, not just of paying an insurance premium, but then the out-of-pocket costs, because oftentimes counseling goes towards a deductible. It's not covered by a simple copay. And so the Affordable Care Act has actually solved a lot of problems in terms of just general coverage of mental health care. Unfortunately, I think that the way that employers are able to afford that for all of their employees is by making some deductibles and out-of-pocket costs astronomical. And so then you see people, especially with the higher cost of living these days, having to make really difficult choices about how to spend their money and how to spend their healthcare dollars. And because mental health care has not risen to the level still as physical health care in terms of need and what to address, it often comes second to that, or maybe third to other types of healthcare. And so I think that's something that we see more and more in the last few years, at least. And then you look at different communities within Iowa that have even more limited access to insurance. We see a number of clients who are uninsured. And so that also limits their accessibility to all kinds of healthcare. And I don't know that I wish I had a solution to that.
Yeah, I'm really appreciative of Lisa's sort of, because when we talk about sort of like why aren't people accessing health, mental health care, it sort of quickly sort of turns itself into stigma, personally held stigma. But I really appreciate Lisa sort of like laying fingers on. There's one of the other significant reasons why people don't seek healthcare are larger systemic matters, like insurance. The other thing that we'll see, especially with employee-based like mental health services, if there's like an employee assistance program or those sorts of things, often systems will provide services, but then are systemically set up not to allow employees to access those services because I'm the only one that sits at this desk. And if I'm not here, then no one's here. And so I can't leave my desk. Or, I'm the person who serves food at the hospital. And so when I come to work, I hit the ground on my feet serving food all day until I leave, and leaving for an hour is not something I'm going to be able to go do to access services that are provided to me. And so what we eventually then find out is those that can always access services are always going to be able to access those services. And those folks, no matter how much you offer, who have never been able to access services, still can't access those services. And so it's not just the availability and the provision of services, but looking at the larger systemic setup that sort of privileges some folks all the time and is always going to unprivilege some folks who are never going to be access services, no matter what you may offer.
I can't nod in agreement strongly enough to that.
Yeah, it's hard to see it if you're not in it, but if you're a person who is in it, it's great that you email all these things out. I'm an employee that doesn't have a computer at work. So you can email all the stuff you want. I'm not someone who is a person with a computer and a desk in an office. And so it's just those kinds of things that happen.
And are there any, whether it's your own organizations or others out there in Iowa, are there resources that have been successful in kind of breaking some of those barriers people face, especially when it comes to lack of insurance or, just funding challenges to seek mental health care?
Well, we all got silent, didn't we? Boy,
Wow.
There's your
So-
answer.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose for anyone watching, that would be something to work on. But I mean, I will say, I guess our access centers in Iowa, I'm more familiar with Lynn and Johnson counties. But for adults, at least, they still have a gap in being able to serve those under age 18. But those are resources that serve anyone, regardless of your situation. So, those are at least something, but it sounds like from the silence of the panel, we have some work to do. We did talk a little earlier in the panel about just kind of the racial demographics of Iowa's mental health care workforce, and maybe, if you're a Black Iowan seeking mental health care and you want someone who can understand those cultural challenges, there may not be enough providers out there, who are able to understand that, and make it okay as look to break some of those barriers. So can you speak to that, Jami, and kind of how Make It Okay has been tailored for to be more culturally inclusive?
Yeah, so I think one of the things we recognize just working with partners across the state is that, stigma does vary by cultures. For some cultures, mental health isn't even a term that is ever used. So I think, recognizing that the Make It Okay campaign, although created for all audiences, we really needed to dig into making sure that it was reaching all audiences, and it wasn't. And so through some work that we did over a year ago, we brought together Black Iowans from across the state to really help build a campaign for their community. So we often say, by their community, for their community. And so they took the Make It Okay campaign, the information, and it was people that represented all walks of life. So it wasn't just, trained mental health therapists, it was barber shop owners, it was people from across their community who could really provide voice to what language would be most appropriate in having this conversation within their community. And so the campaign is a kind of a sister campaign to our Make It Okay work, and it's called Back the Black. And so all of the materials that was created by Black Iowans. And we hope to continue to expand that to other cultures and other groups within our state, because I do think that language does matter. And if we really want to be supportive of all audiences and of all Iowans who live here, that we need to be making sure that we're bringing their voices to the table and letting them really be the leaders and creating how to reach their own community. As a white female, I can't, I don't walk in their shoes, but how do we actually open the door so that we can make it easier for their community to have these conversations and start to be able to seek services in a way that is appropriate for their population and for their community. And so, it's still new. We're still getting it out into the community, but that's also something that's just available and helping reduce the stigma and bring down some of those barriers, specifically in the Black Iowa community throughout the state.
I know you said it's kind of new, but are we seeing any kind of early successes with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is people are having the conversation. Mental health is actually being spoken more than it was in the past, but we definitely have a lot of room for opportunity to continue those conversations. And hopefully we'll start to see some of those happening in the coming years. It takes time, right? So you have to build the trust and you have to build the relationships as well, specifically around this type of topic.
Yeah, I know here in Cedar Rapids, we've seen some of the like at our Juneteenth celebration outside Nubo City Market. Make It Okay has a little info thing there at the Lynn County table. So if you're in the Cedar Rapids area, you can be out on the lookout for that there. Lisa, I know you've talked about kind of serving Spanish-speaking populations. What, from your experience, what has worked well for breaking some of those cultural barriers and language barriers to providing mental health care?
Well, I do think, we all know that having someone who looks like you in any area of life makes us more liable to enter that arena. And so our experience has been that having a native Spanish speaking therapist on staff in our Lynn County office has made a big impact on reaching the Hispanic community. And like we've talked about before, there are some cultural stigmas around mental health. Sometimes the term doesn't even exist. And so being able to put a face on that people can relate to has really opened the doors, and seeing more clients who are native Spanish speakers in the counseling room. And so that's something that unfortunately, I think that in our counseling program cohorts, we don't see a lot of diversity, unfortunately. But I think the more that we can raise up baby counselors who look like the population that we serve, continues to decrease stigma and make some inroads into those communities. And kind of going back to the workplace situation where not every workplace allows time to have appointments. Sometimes that means we have to have non-traditional counseling appointment times. That can also increase accessibility. But that is also, lots of lifestyle implications there, but different ways to make inroads into diverse communities.
I know there's a question here. What about support for BIPOC youth or individuals? What organizations are having conversations about system supports, instead of individual supports for BIPOC individuals and families?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer sort of statewide about that. I know at our Regent universities, and the University of Iowa is no exception to that there are cultural centers on each campus, and each one of those cultural centers then has a mission to then serve its communities. And so at the University of Iowa, for example, there are lots of support activities and a lot of proactive events, support groups, and there are individual counseling opportunities for members of our BIPOC communities.
What type of mental health education or support do you see the biggest need for in our communities?
Well, I'll name one, and it's in no order. This isn't the most important. It's just one. It gives me no pleasure at all to say that the state of Iowa has become increasingly hostile towards our LGBTQ communities. And so we're seeing an increase, unfortunately, in sort of the traumatization of cultural communities in our state based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And so we're seeing an increase in folks talking about mental health concerns as a result of this, where it didn't exist before when LGBTQ people had not become the center of the target of legislative activity in our state. And because of that, we're now seeing a lot of fallout from that, which is it's unneeded and unnecessary. And so we are seeing a great increase in folks asking for help from those communities. And depending on where you live in the state, there may be practitioners. Iowa City, you would think like Iowa City, I'm sure we've got lots of LGBTQ practitioners, and the fact of the matter is we don't. There's a limited number. There's not a lot of us. But one of the things that is available statewide is there's an organization called oneiowa.org. So it's ONE, oneiowa.org. And that's they do a lot of stuff in the state, but one of the things they offer is sort of a statewide clearinghouse of mental health practitioners, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, master's level counselors who specialize in serving our LGBTQ communities. And so if you are someone who's experiencing the fallout of our legislative activity and you live in an area where there aren't a lot of practitioners geographically, oneiowa.org really is a great opportunity to find folks statewide.
And somewhat related to that also, I would say, again, in no particular order, I think that most of us are aware of the high incidence of suicide in the state of Iowa. And I know that there's different initiatives to reduce those numbers over the next 5 years or so. And so I would say that that's probably also an area of concern and outreach and education to help not just identify that and maybe prevent it, but also on the back end to support people who have experienced a loss by suicide.
Yeah, for anyone viewing, I believe 988 is the hotline for that. Jami, did you have anything, just to repeat the question again? What type of mental health education or support do you see the biggest need for in our communities?
While Jami ponders on that, I want to say real quick, if you dial 988 and you are a veteran, if you press 1, once you've dialed 988, it will give you a veteran-specific line. So I just wanted to note that for folks in terms of a population also that needs additional services. Sorry, Jami.
No, I mean, I think Barry and Lisa covered some great opportunities in our state. I mean, there's so many ways that we need to just continue to become more knowledgeable when it comes to this whole conversation, because for some people it's brand new conversations, and for others, they've been having these conversations.
Yeah, in terms of kind of rural versus urban mental health care access. We've talked a little bit about that, but it can be especially challenging for rural areas to have the workforce needed to treat mental health issues in those areas, or just the broadband access telehealth. From your view, what can we do to better break those barriers in rural Iowa and expand access to care?
Well, I think one of the things that's a personal passion of mine, I grew up in a small town in Western Iowa, and my dad's a farmer. And I think the opportunity to identify and connect with partners who are trusted agents of like our rural communities. So when I think of who are the trusted agents that my dad relies upon as a farmer, how do we engage them in these conversations? Because mental health challenges within the farming industry is very high, and suicide rates are extremely high within that population. I think a benefit that, again, we have today that we didn't have even 5 years ago is that you have telehealth options, so that if my dad, in small communities, if my dad had his truck sitting outside the local therapist, I mean, the talk of the town would be like, oh gosh, what's going on with Gary? Why is he, there? Whereas now you can do that in the privacy of your own home. But there are broadband issues as well, right? Do you have quality, high-speed internet that actually you can work to do video conferencing, or do you have to rely on telephone? And how the barriers that can exist because of that for those on the other end, the practitioners, right? So I think we've come a long ways, but we have a long ways still to go in helping make sure that we're providing resources, again, to the communities in a way that is digestible for them and in a way that makes sense for them, that has the language to even have those conversations, and making sure that you're working with partners in a way that, again, they can reach and understand, or they might start to see signs and symptoms, for example, in my dad that maybe I would never see because I'm not with him all the time, but the elevator guy, the banker, the seed guy, like I think about who he's around on a day-to-day basis is very different, and they might start to recognize signs and symptoms or just changes in behavior that maybe seem to be alarming to them. And so how do we actually give them the tools? So again, they don't have to be the therapist, but they can be a resources to know where to maybe get them help and resources that could be beneficial to their mental health and or even physical health.
I think that trusted partner piece is really important. I know that Iowa State Extension is doing a lot of work in the area of stress on the farm, stress on the ranch, and providing trainings to providers like Relationships Can Heal, which help educate providers in the culture of farming. I'm not a farm girl, and so it is a cultural. I am obligated ethically to be culturally competent in working with all of my clients, not just clients of color, but clients who live in rural communities and on farms in a culture that I don't understand. And I think that Iowa State is doing a really good job of providing that. They also provide mental health first aid training, and they're often like boots on the ground in those communities. But even so, there are pockets of rural Iowa that are underserved across the board. And so I know it's a priority of ours at Catholic Charities to really get out into those most rural areas and have a physical presence and a face that people can see to maybe see some of these things and have those conversations and really normalize some of those conversations.
The additional piece I will add is there is a thing called Psych Pack. And Psych Pack is an interstate agreement where psychologists who are licensed in other states can practice in states that are Psych Pack states. So if I'm licensed in Montana, which is a Psych Pack state, and I want to see clients in Oregon, which is a Psych Pack state, if I join Psych Pack, I can see clients in Oregon. And so the vast majority of states in the US have now joined Psych Pack, and there's a small handful of states that are not part of Psych Pack yet, and Iowa is one of them. And so there are lots of rurally based therapists in states all over this country who don't have access to providing services in Iowa. Other mental health degrees do have this interstate agreement, but psychologists do not yet. And so getting legislation moving to allow Iowa to join Psych Pack would bring a whole nationwide availability of mental health practitioners with rural training to serve our more rural locations in Iowa, but we don't have that yet. And so we are limited only to therapists, psychologists licensed in Iowa.
Are there, is there other inspiration that we could take from things that other states or communities are doing to address, provider shortages or licensing requirements or, things like that that may be hindering access to care?
Yeah, there are the venture capitalists saw what was going on 10 years ago, that there was going to be this shortage. And so they smartly decided to invest capital into the provision of mental health services. And so you see advertised on TV and radio and social media all the time of these sort of private enterprises that are offering online mental health services. And so familiarizing oneself with those allows opportunity to participate in that level of care if that's something that you're needing. And because of the way that those programs, those companies have figured out how to use providers and licensure issues, they have figured out how to provide services across states. So there is opportunities in that area for folks to participate in services if they're needing it and can't find it in their local areas. And that's no vouching for the quality. I should just say I'm saying those are things that are available, but what is the quality of those services? That's to be determined.
I'll just give one more reminder for those in the audience. If you'd like to pass along any questions, I still have a few more minutes in the session where I'll be able to incorporate those. So feel free. Actually just got one right here. How do families start to have conversations around mental health, specifically families where talking about feelings and emotions is just not the norm?
Great question. Well, a couple of things I'm thinking about. One is social media is all about this right now. And so the fact that no one's talking about, that your kids aren't talking about mental health or not being exposed to the voices of mental health is simply not true. They're exposed to it all the time. There are TikTokers that is their channel, and they have millions and millions of followers because I'm a TikToker who posts daily videos talking about my life with bipolar disorder. There are lots of therapists online who are giving quick advice via Facebook and again TikTok and all sorts of different other platforms, giving advice and suggestions about mental health. And so one way that families can begin to start to have these conversations is that parents, guardians asking kids, what are you seeing tell me what you're finding out about mental health on social media, and get the conversation going. And hopefully then kids will talk a little bit about what they're getting out there. And some of it's really good, most of it's not. And so having those conversations on the basis of I know you're seeing this stuff on social media, it is an easy kind of leveled way to begin having those conversations. We don't necessarily have to go from no one talks about feelings, so now I'm going to tell you about all my misery and doubt that I've harbored all these years. It's not 0 to 60. It can be 0 to 5. And at 5 is so what are you finding out on social media about mental health, and getting the conversation going that way.
Yeah, I would agree. There's also a lot of other great resources online. May is Mental Health Month. There's some great tools available in talking to kids about all different kinds of topics, including social media and feelings and what to do with anger and how to cope. Area education agency websites also are a great resource of information, not just for teachers, but for parents and how to talk to their kids, and more education about what social emotional learning is, because I agree with Barry, the kids are hearing it all the time in school, online. And so it's finding a way, and some sentence starters, finding a way to engage them in those conversations and slowly ramp it up, not go, 0 to 80 right away.
I would just add, I think, the conversation can be part of just overall health and wellness, right? We silo a lot of things in our society, especially when it comes to our body. We silo every organ into a specialty. We silo mental health outside of just health in general, right? So as you're talking with your children, it can be just as much as you're talking about ways to take care of yourself, whether it's heart health, right? It's brain health, it's your mental health. I mean, so that we don't have to always keep these siloed. My body is connected from my head to my toes, so we should be having those conversations as one, not just talking about one organ differently than the rest.
Yeah, I think Jami raises such a really important point, and it made me think of another thing. One of the things we're seeing happening across the country is there's an increasing sort of focus on sort of well-being. And the nice thing about the movement towards well-being is it's taking mental health, which has often been seen as the problem, and finding out that maybe mental health is actually the outcome. Because so many other things kind of in the portrait of my well-being are off whack, right? It could be my physical health, it could be my social relationships, it could be my diet, it could be my sort of financial standing. Any of those kinds of things then begin to affect all the other parts. And again, we have often looked at mental health as kind of the problem. And what we're discovering with greater and greater research into well-being is that mental health is often the outcome of things being not in great array in other areas of my life.
Sometimes you just gotta take a mental health walk or eat a vegetable, drink some water.
Yep. Simple acts begin to pile up in really good ways. I would agree.
More audience questions. What's the range for concern when it comes to mental health? How do you gauge when it's simply a rough day versus time to seek professional guidance like 988?
Well, oftentimes, like they've acknowledged, it's not a matter of just a bad day. A bad day can just be a bad day, but it's kind of the accumulation of what are the number of symptoms that somebody is having. And then time is always a really important factor. What's the duration? How long have they been experiencing this? And that all can be discovered through having a very, person first, non-stigmatizing language type of conversation with someone just about how are you feeling? How long have you been feeling this way? Very non-threatening types of questions.
I think about it from the perspective, yes, exactly. And I also would add on, I think about the perspective of sort of, you don't need to know what anxiety is necessarily. You don't need to sort of be able to diagnose depression. You don't need to necessarily know what are the symptoms of panic. What I'm looking for is I'm looking for significant changes in mood and attitude. When I know Jami to be one way all the time, and then all of a sudden across a period of a couple of weeks, she's different. Something's not, I sort of, my intuitive sense is like, something's not right. Something's not right. Something's wrong here. She's late a lot, was never late, or, always kind of like showed up and sat right at the top of the room for our meetings and now sits in the back a lot. Or always kind of like, hey, how are you? And was chipper in the morning and now doesn't even greet me, or never greeted anyone, is now greeting everybody. It can be that direction too. And it's that intuitive sense that when you interact with somebody and you start to think to yourself, that's odd. That's the moment when you start to think like maybe something's going on. And then, as Lisa said, leaning into that type of conversation to say, I see you, I recognized you. I noticed a difference and was concerned enough and care enough about you to ask you about yourself. And sometimes just the very act of raising my awareness to you begins to raise your awareness about yourself, where you may not have noticed this until someone said, are you okay? And you're like, oh, gosh, you noticed, maybe I'm not okay. No one's brought it to my attention. And so recognizing and listening to that intuitive sense, that spidey tingle, as the students will say, that something may not be right here because I see something significantly has changed, even if I'm not sure what it is or how serious or what level of care it needs.
When a problem begins to affect a person's ability to go to school or work or affect their ability to enjoy relationships that they normally enjoyed, yeah, that's when the spidey tingle should happen.
I think this will probably be the final audience question, or maybe two more. But can you share a story without identifying anyone of someone who successfully got past worry about stigma surrounding mental health? What was the breakthrough for them?
Well, I don't have a specific story, but I can tell you that based on our data, most people come to counseling, at least to our counseling, because a friend or a family member recommended it or suggested it. And so it's oftentimes that trusted relationship. And like Barry said, leaning into those conversations, sometimes that can be the deciding factor.
Okay, I got a story. It took a second to think about it. this professor is no longer at this university, but there was a professor at this university. She's moved on to somewhere else. This professor used to invite me in once a semester to address her like giant lecture hall of like 300 students, just to come talk about, when I was the director of the counseling service, talk about counseling services. And the very first thing she would do before I would have my audience with the students is she would get up and say, we're going to talk about this topic. I want you to know that when I was in college, I struggled, and she would tell her story. And then she would say, and I sought counseling services. And then I would follow up with her to say, you know, it's unusual what you do. You tell your students that like you, I struggle. And like you, I went and saw counseling services. You can too. Do students ever come up to you and say, hey, you're the first person, or because you said it led me to? And every semester she had students that would come up to her and say, I've never had a professor or an instructor or anybody self-divulge and sort of be vulnerable to me in the way that you were. And tell me more about that now. So that sort of self-divulging of, I'm not just going to advise you, I'm going to tell you, I'm not just giving you advice that I would never follow myself. I'm giving you advice based on my own experience of advice I took myself. And I think that makes a difference.
And I think we've seen more of that, right? The vulnerability of even executives or CEOs of company, when they have been more open and willing to share their personal journey, I think, you know, it provides a level of trust and for that culture of that organization, so that other people can feel comfortable sharing their story. And I've seen that. I think my story on this is just primarily, you know, Healthy Estate before was, we really focused on the physical health side of things, and we really hadn't addressed the mental health component of it. And as we moved into launching Make It Okay, I had more people reach out to me, even just say, well, it looks like you're doing some stuff in mental health, and sharing just even more, I think, vulnerability with me, even of how to like, well, Jami must understand because they're doing this work. And I definitely have, you know, seen more of my own stigmas reduced, like I talked about earlier. And so I think, you know, because we are being more vulnerable and we are being more open about it, that people are starting to recognize that it's an opportunity for them, maybe themselves at that moment, or there's these aha moments when stories come out that XYZ has shared their personal journey as well.
I love the tell me a story question. Thank you.
Yeah, I know we are close to time here, so we'll end on this question. For each panelist, what's your idea in terms of overcoming the stigma in embracing mental health and talking about it in Iowa? You know, what would you consider a win 5 years from now?
Well, my win would be that we talk about mental health like we talk about all other health. So I don't think people are afraid to talk about diabetes, right? So 1 in 10 Iowans have diabetes, but 1 in 5 have a mental illness. So it needs to be on the same playing field. We need to be having the same conversations about mental health like we do our physical health. And so if we can get to that point, and that we have systems in place that actually support our mental health, like we have systems in place that support our physical health, I think we've come a long ways.
Mm-hmm. I guess my win would be if in the next 5 years we can reduce or improve the language that we use around mental health. So instead of people being nuts and crazy, they're just living with something. Like you might live with high cholesterol or high blood pressure, you're living with a brain health issue. I'd love to see there to be maybe a coalition within the state of Iowa with the goal of training a certain number of people to be mental health first aiders, and to continue that message on beyond the counseling office.
Mm-hmm. Those are really good. Those are great. I don't have much to add in addition to those. I would say both of those. I'll just sort of circle back to something I mentioned before, which is PsychPack. I think eventually if Iowa continues not to participate in that, psychologists are going to stop coming to Iowa because they will be too financially disenfranchised to participate in the marketplace by coming to this state. So to attract more practitioners to this state, participation in things like PsychPack are going to be critical.
Yeah, well, thank you to all of you, our panelists, for participating in this discussion, and to those of you viewing, and to this in-depth week's presenting sponsor, Foundation 2. Please join us again for the full Iowa Ideas Conference, October 10th and 11th. Thank you.
Thank you.